Hi class, welcome back to this second portion of the Multilingualism lecture. In the first portion of the lecture, we discussed the incidence of multilingualism, distribution of the world's languages, importance of discussing multilingualism, a few definitions, the means of attainment, and levels of multilingualism within a society. In this second portion of the lecture, we are going to be looking at a phenomenon within multilingualism, primarily diglossia. And toward the end of the lecture, we will briefly touch on code switching, although it won't be covered in depth here, as you'll have a chance to read substantially about code switching in your readings this week, as well as discussing it in some forum questions. So without further ado, let us jump into diglossia. Unlike the typical characterization of bilingualism as a phenomenon of the individual, diglossia is a phenomenon where bilingualism is societally dictated and consistent across the vast majority of the society. Diglossia is an interesting form of community-instituted bilingualism, marked by age-gradedness. So in essence, bilingualism is a feature of individuals. Diglossia is a feature of entire speech communities. Diglossia occurs when two distinct varieties of language or of a language exist side by side throughout the speech community. And this week you'll read about Joshua Fishman and Charles Ferguson. They have slightly different ideas about what constitutes a distinct variety or a distinct speech community, so watch for those two distinctions this week in your readings. Diglossia occurs where each of the varieties are assigned a definite social function. In other words, there's complementary distribution of the use of the two varieties. Diglossia occurs where each of the varieties are considered discrete entities. Diglossia is suggested when the two varieties are typically considered high and low. And you may be asking, what are the high and low varieties? Let's take a closer look at that. So we can distinguish between high and low varieties by looking at a few characteristics, primarily acquisition, value, prescription, development, which is noted by the D, and characterization noted by the final C. With the low variety, looking at acquisition, the low variety is learned at home, while the high variety is learned formally, typically through formal schooling. The value, most people view the low variety as common, while the high variety is viewed as prestigious. The low variety is used every day, while the high variety is used for more specialized communication circumstances. The development of the language, meaning what is their status in terms of standardization. So with the low variety, it's possibly standardized, and the high variety is usually always standardized. And then the final C, characterization, what is felt about the varieties. So how do people feel about these two varieties of speech? Typically, people view the low variety as mundane or something that we have to use for communication, but the high variety is viewed as this beautiful language. This is really common with Arabic, where there's two varieties, the colloquial and the standard. People typically feel the colloquial is, it's more of a base form of Arabic, but the standardized is the true form, the form that is everyone should speak and is the most beautiful. Looking a little bit more closely at the high and low varieties, the high variety is typically used for delivering sermons, lectures, political speeches, writing poetry or literature, writings you'll find in the newspaper, or religious writings. And then the low is used for common everyday purposes, giving instructions to workers of low prestige, conversation with family members, political cartoons, soap operas, popular radio programs, and the like. So there are a few more distinctions between the high and the low. Knowing these things about the high and low, consider some of the recommendations you would have to make if you were tasked to making a decision whether or not to develop a literacy program or a translation project in a community you found to be diglossic. What language would be used for the development of written literature or for writing scripture itself? What language or form would an audio cassette version of the same literature or translation be found in? And then, specifically with literacy, what about the general literacy materials? What would you be saying about the literature if you used the high form? Or what would you be saying about the literature if you used the low form? Moving on, there are a few mechanisms that maintain diglossia. Fishman has argued that diglossia is based on social compartmentalization, or on the maintenance of strict boundaries between the societal functions associated with the high and low varieties, respectively. It is also Fishman's opinion that diglossia is a necessary condition for language maintenance, especially by minority language communities. There must be clear functional separation of the languages, and the institutionalization of these functional differences contribute to stable social compartmentalization, which in turn guarantees a stable type of societal bilingualism. So to sum all that up, in typical Fishman fashion, he uses 16 words when 2 will do. The maintenance of diglossia requires social compartmentalization, clear functional separation between the languages, and institutionalization of these functional differences. There are also mechanisms undermining diglossia, or promoting a shift from a diglossic situation. These factors in modern life mitigate social compartmentalization, especially among young immigrant groups in countries where there is a dominating culture or language. The increase in open networks, the ability to cross social boundaries, also leads to a shift from diglossia. Additionally, in fluid role relationships, so for example, if someone is a boss in one context, a worker in another context, a soccer teammate in another, these different role relations lead to a shift from diglossia. Moving quickly through the other factors leading to a shift from diglossia: superficial public familiarity, or ease of communication between strangers or almost strangers. In non-status stressing interactions, meaning there is social egalitarianism. And the rationalization of the work sphere, or the leveling, again, a product of an egalitarian society. And other factors such as urbanization, massification, and mobility all lead to a shift away from diglossia. A shift away from diglossia can often lead to what sociolinguists call leaky diglossia. This is a phenomenon observed by some field linguists, where a community has historically been considered diglossic, but there is evidence that linguistic codes previously restricted to certain domains and not others are now crossing those lines of restriction. I want to take a moment now to distinguish between diglossia and bilingualism. When we're looking at acquisition, In diglossia, one of the codes in a diglossic situation is formally taught through social institutions. Only those who are school-aged and above, or who can otherwise access the societal institution, will use the high code. So here, institutionalized is looking at education, typically. In bilingualism, the individual may or may not have needed to go to school in order to learn the second language. In diglossia, typically the high form is only learned through formal education. In a diglossic situation, the social sphere, say that 5 times fast, where it is appropriate to use one code or another is rigidly defined. In a bilingual situation, use of the codes may be associated with different domains, but the rigid prescription of the use of one code or another is not typical. In bilingualism, if you are speaking with a close friend or if you are giving a public lecture, it's not dictated which language you have to use. However, in diglossia, that domain would dictate what language you needed to use. In a diglossic situation, there is a differential in the perceived intrinsic value attributed to the varieties involved. The high code is considered more beautiful, logical, and expressive, whereas the low code is considered mundane. In bilingualism, no societal value is placed on the languages spoken by bilingual individuals in the community. Finally, diglossia is a characterization of linguistic organization at the social-cultural level. Bilingualism is essentially a characterization of individual linguistic behavior. Now that we've learned a bit about diglossia, and as you read through your assignments this week, think about how diglossia applies to your language development context, or if it doesn't apply. This concludes this week's PowerPoint lecture. In one of the topics this week, we will also be learning about another phenomenon of multilingualism, code switching. As we said at the beginning, code switching will not be covered in this lecture, but you will have plenty of opportunity to interact with the material through our course readings and discussion forums. Have a great week, and if you have any questions, please don't forget to post to the course questions forum.